It began with a question of crowns and ended in a century of blood. For 116 years, England and France were locked in a brutal, relentless conflict that reshaped medieval Europe. Kings rose and fell, kingdoms burned, and entire generations were lost to the fury of a war that refused to end. And at the heart of it all stood one battle, fought in the mud of northern France, where a small, desperate English army faced overwhelming odds. The Battle of Agincourt, a moment that turned an English king into a legend and humiliated the pride of France. This is the story of the 100 Years' War and how Agincourt shattered France while crowning England's might. The roots of the conflict go back to the year 1066, when William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel, defeated Harold Godwinson at Hastings, and became King of England. But while William took England, he never gave up his French lands. For the next 2 centuries, English kings would rule not just England, but large parts of France as dukes and counts, vassals to the French crown. It was an impossible situation: 2 kings, 1 land, and centuries of rivalry waiting to ignite. By the early 14th century, that spark finally came. In 1328, the King of France, Charles IV, died without a male heir. The closest relative was his nephew, Edward III of England, whose mother was Charles's sister. By blood, Edward had a claim to the French throne, but the French nobles rejected the idea of an English king ruling France. Instead, they chose Philip VI, a cousin of Charles, invoking an old Frankish custom that excluded inheritance through the female line. Edward was furious. What began as a political insult soon turned into open war. In 1337, he declared himself the rightful king of France and launched what history would call the 100 Years' War. At first, England seemed unstoppable. Edward III's armies crushed the French at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. French knights, clad in armor and mounted on proud horses, charged recklessly into English longbow fire. Arrows rained down like iron hail, cutting through men and horses alike. By nightfall, the flower of French chivalry lay dead. 2 years later, at Calais, Edward captured the vital port and secured a permanent foothold on the continent. Then, in 1356, his son, the famous Black Prince, repeated the devastation at the Battle of Poitiers, capturing the French king himself, John II, and forcing France into chaos. For a moment, it seemed like England had won the war, but victory came with a price. France was shattered, yes, but so was England's economy. The war dragged on. Plague swept across Europe, killing millions. Both kingdoms were exhausted, yet neither willing to yield. Decades passed. Generations of warriors grew up knowing nothing but war. By the late 14th century, England's power began to wane. Edward III was dead. His successors were weaker, divided by politics and rebellion. In France, the young King Charles V rebuilt the nation's strength, retaking lost territory and driving the English from much of their conquests. But fate had one more twist to play. In 1413, a new king came to the English throne. Henry of Henry was not just a ruler. He was a soldier, a tactician, and a man of iron will. He had fought in rebellion, seen battle, and understood the power of discipline. While France descended into civil war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, Henry saw his chance. The time to strike had come again. In 1415, he invaded. His army was small, around 12,000 men, a mix of longbowmen, men-at-arms, and knights. They landed in Normandy and besieged the port city of Harfleur. But the siege dragged on, disease broke out, and when the city finally surrendered, Henry's army was reduced to nearly half its strength. Many urged him to retreat to England. Henry refused. He decided to march across enemy territory to the English stronghold at Calais, a bold, almost suicidal move. The French, meanwhile, rallied an army of over 20,000 men, heavily armored knights and nobles. Eager to crush the invaders once and for all, rain poured as the two armies met on October 25, 1415, near the small village of Agincourt. The battlefield was narrow, hemmed in by woods and soaked in mud. The French knights laughed. They outnumbered the English 2-1. To them, this would be an easy victory. But Henry's army was disciplined, battle-hardened, and perfectly positioned. He placed his archers, thousands of English longbowmen, on the flanks behind wooden stakes. The center was held by men-at-arms, exhausted but resolute. As dawn broke, the mud glistened, the mist hung low, and the fate of nations waited to be decided. For hours, neither side moved. Then Henry gave the order. English archers stepped forward and unleashed a storm of arrows. The sky darkened with shafts that whistled through the air, cutting down horses and knights. The French responded with a full charge, a wall of steel surging across the muddy field. But the mud was their enemy. The rain-soaked earth turned to a quagmire, sucking down horses and men. The heavy armor that once made the French invincible now became a death trap. As they slipped and stumbled, the English longbowmen fired again and again, arrows piercing visors, striking joints, bringing down the mighty French knights one by one. When the French finally reached the English lines, they were exhausted and disorganized. The English counterattacked with swords, axes, and maces. The melee was brutal. Men fighting knee-deep in mud, slipping over corpses, gasping for air beneath crushed helmets. The French second wave tried to advance but collided with their own fleeing men. Panic spread. By mid-afternoon, the field of Agincourt was a nightmare. Thousands of French nobles were dead or captured. Among them were some of France's greatest lords, the constable, the admiral, and countless knights. The French losses were catastrophic. The English, miraculously, had lost fewer than 500 men. It was one of the most stunning victories in medieval history. Against impossible odds, Henry V had annihilated the pride of France. He had proven that discipline, tactics, and terrain could defeat even the mightiest army of knights. News of Agincourt spread across Europe like wildfire. England rejoiced. Henry was hailed as the new Alexander, the chosen king. In France, despair reigned. The nobles blamed each other. The factions deepened, and the country slid further into ruin. But the war wasn't over. Henry returned in 1417 with another invasion, this time to conquer, not just raid. City after city fell. By 1419, Paris itself was threatened. The Burgundians, seeking revenge for their leader's assassination, allied with Henry. The French king, Charles VI, was mentally unstable and powerless. In 1420, the Treaty of Troyes sealed France's humiliation. Henry married Charles's daughter, Catherine of Valois, and was declared heir to the French throne. The Dauphin, Charles' son, was disinherited. For the first time, England seemed poised to rule both kingdoms, but fate once again turned cruel. Just 2 years later, Henry fell ill while campaigning in France. He died in 1422 at the age of 35, never to wear the French crown. His infant son, Henry VI, became king of both England and France, but a baby could not hold together two empires built on war. The tide began to turn. The French rallied behind the disinherited Dauphin, now Charles VII. And from the ashes of defeat rose a figure who would change everything. Joan of Arc, a teenage peasant girl who claimed divine visions. Joan inspired the broken French army to fight again. Her courage at Orléans in 1429 turned despair into hope. For the first time in decades, French troops defeated the English in open battle. Joan's victories paved the way for Charles's coronation at Reims, a symbolic triumph that restored France's legitimacy. Though Joan was later captured and executed by the English, her spirit transformed the war. France was no longer fighting for nobles or land. It was fighting for survival, for pride, and for the soul of the nation. Over the next decades, France clawed its way back. Under capable leaders and reorganized armies, they drove the English from Normandy, from Aquitaine, and finally from all of France except Calais. In 1453, after more than a century of conflict, the 100 Years' War finally ended. France was devastated, but reborn. Its monarchy was stronger, its armies professional, its people united. England, on the other hand, was broke, divided, and bitter. The dream of a dual kingdom had died. Soon after, England descended into its own civil war, the Wars of the Roses. Yet even in defeat, England had changed the nature of warfare. The longbow, the discipline of common soldiers, and the mastery of tactics over chivalric bravado had rewritten the rules of battle. The age of knights had ended. The age of strategy had begun, and Agincourt, that muddy, rain-soaked field, stood as the moment when the myth of invincible French nobility collapsed before the power of organized, determined infantry. For centuries, poets and playwrights would remember it. Shakespeare immortalized Henry IV's words to his men, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." It wasn't just a line. It was the essence of the battle itself. a moment when courage, leadership, and unity overcame the might of numbers and pride. The 100 Years' War wasn't just a feud between kings. It was the birth of nations England and France emerging as rivals, equals, and distinct identities. Out of the ashes of endless war came the foundation of the modern European state. That arrogance can destroy even the strongest army. That a nation divided cannot stand against one united by purpose. And that in the mud and chaos of war, history is decided not by the size of armies, but by the will of those who lead them. The 100 Years' War began as a struggle for crowns.